I'm Fred Pullen, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Internet Explorer. And I like to kick off with a humorous video, slightly self-deprecating. I think because we're under no delusions as to where IE came from and where we're going. The good news is IE9 is a pretty significant improvement over IE8, and IE10 is even better. So I've talked to a lot of customers, I've talked to a lot of partners, and there's a lot of excitement about IE10 from the area of standard support, the area of security, the area of performance, and those are all things that we can talk to today. Now, just to introduce myself, I spent about 15 years as an IT pro before joining Microsoft 10 years ago as a technical evangelist. So this is my first marketing role. Don't hold it against me. I still, have my technical chops. So we're going to go through some demos. Hopefully I'll be able to address most, if not all, of your questions. Any questions that I can't answer, I did bring a stack of business cards. So please reach out to me, and if I don't know the answer, I can find out the answer. Years of consulting taught me that, at least. So please, I do want to make this as interactive as possible. With an audience this size, it'll be a little bit difficult. Tell you what, if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, talking to the microphone. And if I need to, I'll delay or defer questions till the end. But I do want to make this as interactive as possible. It's not just me talking for 75 minutes, hopefully. All right, Internet Explorer 10 administration. What we're going to cover as part of this session is how to customize the browser and some areas of customization that customers typically do. We'll also talk about browser management and the group policies that you can use to manage the browser. We always talk about 1,500 or so group policies. That's great, but how do you actually navigate those things? I'll also talk about some deployment methods and best practices there. The good news is, the bottom line is, whatever you're using to manage your Windows infrastructure today is what you can use to manage Internet Explorer. We've really made sure that Internet Explorer is a seamless part of Windows. So whatever you're using today to manage Active Directory or manage your even unmanaged computers to a certain extent, you can use to manage Internet Explorer, and I'll talk about that some as well. And then finally, App Compat. I like to call the App Compat section App Compat for IT pros, because it's been 10 years since I did any kind of development, and I was not a good developer. I was a great IT pro. I was not a good developer at all. So I'm under no delusions about what you can do from a development standpoint. You can do a ton of things. This is App Compat for the IT pros in the audience. This is App Compat with all the stuff you can do without cracking the website code to make sure that the applications and websites are compatible. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention here about Internet Explorer 10, because I think there's some confusion about this. You'll see two screenshots on the screen here. One is the immersive Internet Explorer 10 experience through Windows 8, and the other is the legacy desktop browser. And I wanted to explain both of those a little bit, because I think there is some confusion in the press and there's some confusion online. Easiest way to say it is, these are two experiences that use the same underlying browsing engine. They both use iExplore.exe. They both use the same underlying process. But Internet Explorer, like Windows and a lot of folks at Microsoft, had a difficulty. And there's a natural tension here, and I wanted to explain that for a second. The natural tension is, how do you take the web forward and adopt modern standards, adopt a more secure browser, while at the same time not breaking the web for everybody else? And I think we actually came upon a good compromise here. The compromise is this. We have the immersive Internet Explorer 10 for Windows 8 that's very touch-friendly, it's fast-friendly, perfect for touch. And by default, it runs in 64-bit mode without plugins. So it runs in what we call enhanced protected mode. So by default, it's going to be a little more secure. It's more standards-based. We see the future of the web as really plug-in-free browsing, with HTML5, CSS3 really stepping up and taking the place of a lot of the legacy ActiveX controls that we used to have. Now, at the same time, we have lots and lots of customers who said, don't break the web for my web apps. And we listened. And so we do have the traditional legacy browsing experience. By default, it's 32-bit. By default, it supports your plugins, your ActiveX controls, your Java, your Silverlight, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to have the best of both worlds, and the great news is it's still the same underlying rendering engine. It's still the same iExplore.exe. And many of the group policies that apply to one apply to both. So you can manage your infrastructure and not worry as much about touch versus non-touch. It really, for me, personally, it depends on the device. If I'm using a touch device, I love the immersive full-screen experience. It works well in Surface and other Windows RT devices. It works well in Windows 8. But if I'm on a legacy machine that doesn't have touch, I spend more time in the legacy desktop browser, just a personal preference. Now, as we go through the presentation, I touched on Windows RT. Internet Explorer 10 is obviously available for Windows 7, Windows 8, and Server 2012, Server 2008 R2, et cetera. But it also is supported on Windows RT. And a few places where that makes a difference, I will call that out. Because Windows RT devices are obviously unmanaged today, so it presents some additional challenges when you're talking about group policies and things like that. All right, let's start going through the details. Customizing the browser. These are some areas of typical customization. This isn't everything that you can do to customize the browser, but this is what our customers typically do. Now, they might rebrand it and there are two ways of doing this. I'll explain this in a minute, but you can actually have a distribution of Internet Explorer for external distribution or for internal distribution. And so if you're customizing this for your company, you can add your company logo, you can add your company name to the title bar. There are some things you can do to match the color branding. But I think more importantly, you can also change the favorites. You can also change some of the help menu, for example. You can add your company's help site to that menu. So there's some easy things that you can do that help the customer. You can also change security settings. You can add add-on components. I mentioned before, we don't want to break the web. So we do have the ability for you to add those ActiveX controls for those legacy sites. And you can change connection settings to make it very easy for people to connect the right way. Now, this is an area where, as I go through creating a package of Internet Explorer using the Internet Explorer Administration Kit, this is a way that you can distribute a version of IE that actually goes out to unmanaged devices. I'll say that again. You can actually create a package that you can use to control those unmanaged devices. Now, the limitation is, since they're unmanaged, those users can go and change those settings at any time. We really rely on the administration kit to set the defaults, but you can't really enforce those defaults unless you back it up with group policies. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, so I mentioned the IEAK. When we released Internet Explorer 10 for Windows 7, we did a minor update of the IEAK for IE 10. And we now support Windows 7, both 32-bit and 64-bit. So there's one distribution package you download. There's basically there's a drop-down menu I'll show you that has Windows 8, 64-bit, 32-bit, Windows 7, 64-bit, 32-bit. And you can choose how you want to build a package. Now, at that point, you can build a relatively seamless package. You don't have to bother the user with a lot of user interface. You don't have to bother them with questions. You can make a silent install package, in other words. I get the questions sometimes, so I'll preemptively address some of these questions. There is an option that we'll look at that says, don't force a reboot or force a reboot. Sometimes that's outside of our control if there's an ActiveX plugin or something else that you're trying to get installed, or you're making connection settings, it may force a reboot. But as much as possible, you can tell it, choose a silent install. The other thing I'll mention along these lines is, don't feel like you have to build a custom package to deploy Internet Explorer. You actually have a number of different command line switches from the Internet Explorer distribution package itself. So you can use a command line switch just with the Internet Explorer package that says install silently, install with these defaults, and you can change a few of those settings just through the command line. So you can very easily use whatever deployment package you use today, whether it's WSUS, whether it's System Center, third-party packages. You can use those to deploy either the vanilla version of Internet Explorer, just with some of those silent flags, or you can use it to deploy your customized package that you create using the IEAK. Either way, we want to make things as flexible as possible for your particular environment. I mentioned briefly that we now have 2 distribution packages, or 2 ways to license this, essentially. We simplified this a little bit. We used to have 3 license types: Internet service providers, Internet content providers, and corporate customers. We've simplified that to be, let's just say, external and internal customers. So we've made it relatively simple. When you install the IEAK, you get a choice, and you can choose external or internal to create distribution packages for either of those types. All right, let's dive through the demo now. Let me switch over here. I'm running Windows 8 in a Hyper-V environment on my new Lenovo X1 Carbon laptop. So everything seems to work fine, but you're always taking a choice on a 2-day-old laptop, so we'll see. Hyper-V seems to work really well for demos of this type. Now I'm going to go ahead and click this off. I previously installed the IEAK. I also made the screen really big because the dialog box is sometimes a little small. So I made the screen a little bit big. It scrolls off the edge of the screen, but hopefully you can see most of the content up here. All right, by default, it's going to choose a destination folder. So it'll choose a build folder. And then you have a choice. As I mentioned before, you have the drop-downs, Windows 8 or Windows 7, 64-bit or 32-bit. Something to keep in mind here is that you may, since Windows 8 includes Internet Explorer 10, you have the option of creating essentially a settings-only package. That is, the package itself can be very, very, very small because it's just updating the settings on Windows 8. We know that all the Windows 8 machines out there already have Internet Explorer 10. Even if someone has installed Chrome or Firefox, and I'm being realistic here, even if somebody's chosen to install another browser, we still can update the browser settings for IE10 because it's a Windows component. Someone would have to take the more severe additional step of actually uninstalling that Windows component or actually disabling that Windows component before it would break something like a settings-only distribution package. Yes, question?
So if it's a 64-bit OS, is it a single package with both versions of the program, or are they 2 packages?
It's a great question. If it's a 64-bit OS, am I creating 2 different distribution packages for 64-bit versus 32-bit, or is it one distribution package? And I'll answer that 2 ways. One is, if you're creating one distribution package for Windows 8 64-bit, you can choose to create one that has both the settings only and the full distribution package. So you can create a 64-bit package that includes the whole shebang as well as just the settings. But you also do need to create a separate distribution package for your 32-bit OSs. And in a lot of organizations, that's simply an additional rule in System Center or whatever you're using to push out that package. Is it a 64-bit OS? Is it a 32-bit OS? Or you can even write a script to that extent. If it's 32-bit, use this package that's on the share. If it's 64-bit, use this package that's on the share. If it's 64, it's just doing 64. Yeah, so if you're creating a 64-bit distribution package, it is just creating the package for 64-bit Windows 8 system. Yes, question?
And it's Windows 8 only, or 64-bit, 7, and 8?
No, it's Windows 8 only. So there's 2 pivots here. One is it Windows 8 or Windows 7? The other is it 64-bit or 32-bit? And you could end up potentially with 4 different distribution packages. And for the quick ones, you may actually figure you could actually have a settings-only package for Windows 8 or Windows 7, and you could also have the full distribution package. So you could actually have, instead of 4 different distribution packages, you could actually have 8. Yes, question? Will the 64-bit package include both 32-bit and 64-bit versions of IE? No, it only contains the 64-bit version of IE. Yes?
Will you get these same
Yes, that's correct. And the question is, will you get these options no matter where you're running this particular IEAK? And the answer is yes. There's one other nuance that I'll mention. For those of you supporting multiple languages, the IEAK is available in, I think it's 26 languages, but you can create packages in whatever languages Windows supports. So the IEAK, as an administrative tool, is only supported in those 26 or so languages. But certainly you can use the English version, the Chinese version, Russian, whatever version, to create packages in whatever Windows languages you're supporting. There was another hand over there. OK, yes?
So if the 64-bit package only contains the executable for iExplorer 64, what happens with the 32-bit version that's already installed on Windows 7? Does it stay there with IE9?
So let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. For a Windows 7 environment where you're running, is it a 64-bit? 64-bit OS. You've got IE9, which has 32-bit and 64. You're replacing it with the 64-bit. Actually, I misspoke earlier. I'm sorry. You're right. It does. I'm sorry. It does include. I misunderstood the question. It does include the process. Once you've installed it, obviously the 64-bit version also has the 32-bit executable. I'm sorry if I misspoke there. What I meant to say was it includes the 64-bit distribution package for Internet Explorer 10, which does include the processes for 32-bit and 64. Does that make more sense? OK, sorry. I had some confused looks. I'm sorry I misunderstood the question earlier. All right, so let's go ahead and create a package. Let's say it's 64-bit Windows 8. Actually, let's double check here. I think I'm running 32-bit, and I want to create a package that I can actually show you. Yeah. 64. OK, good. All right, so let's create a Windows 8 64-based package. I can choose a target language, and again, this includes everything that Windows supports. So I wanted to make it very clear that it does support all of the Windows languages. I can choose the full installation package, the configuration package, or both. So again, it can create this. If IE10 is already installed on the machine, it can just use the settings package, make it a little more efficient. In this case, obviously, I do have IE10 installed. I'm just going to create the configuration-only package. All right, do you want to run the software? Yes. It's going to check the version against what is available in the cloud and download the latest version of IE if there's an updated version. I ran this last night just to make sure I had the latest version. And here's where you can choose an interactive installation, a hands-free installation, or completely silent. And again, the restart options, no restart, doesn't restart when installation is complete. Again, this is somewhat dependent on what you're trying to install. If you're installing a third-party package that does require a reboot, then that will guide that. You can customize the title bar, toolbar buttons, search providers. Add a home page. This is the easiest thing to show, so I'll just go ahead and do this. I'm going to add in Bing.com. We'll actually have two home pages then, MSN and Bing. You can choose to retain the previous home page or to just simply get rid of that and replace it with what you choose. You can also, this is where you'd add your own support URL. So if you had an internal support site, you could add this as a support page. Accelerators. And this is where you can choose different favorites, maybe add some URLs from your corporate network. I spoke yesterday, 2 days ago, with an educational system, basically a state educational board. And they love using this functionality for being able to push out their default URLs. Here's where all the tools are. Most of the computers that are on their system are unmanaged. These are computers that folks are bringing in from their home. Students could be running a variety of different things, but they're able to use this kind of functionality to make sure that they have the right URLs and the right connection settings within their corporate network. Select options for managing items under favorites. You can replace, delete existing items and replace them, and so on. You can go through the first run wizard if someone hasn't done that before. You can use the IE10 welcome page. If it is the first time they're running it, it'll go through the first run page and then give them that welcome page. You can choose compatibility view versus standards view, and I'll get more into detail on standards versus compatibility towards the end of the session. You can import current connection settings, delete existing dial-up settings, and so on. Enable automatic configuration. So you can choose a drop point on your network where you can leave updated settings. And so when someone runs Internet Explorer, it checks periodically to see if there are updated settings that sit out there. Does anybody use this? Does it work for you? Almost. Okay. Like I say, 15 years of consulting, I don't like to recommend something unless I've actually tried it myself. This I've only used in a couple of places, and it is tricky. The configuration itself is a little tricky. So it takes some practice to get this running, but once it is running, it can be a very efficient way to push out settings. Proxy settings. Security zones and privacy. So you can set the different security zones, intranet sites, choose which sites show up in those zones. Customize program settings or import current settings. And here's where you can choose additional settings. And this is where you can drill in on specific custom settings. Going into the advanced page, turning off some specific settings. So lots of different ways of configuring this. And now it's just simply going to go create the package. It's in 4.11.2013, so let's go look for that. Builds, 4.11.2013. You see it says 64 Win8. Now there's two. There's an application and there's a Windows installer, kind of the MSI. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and run the MSI. Now just to show you, there's nothing up this sleeve, nothing up this sleeve. Let's go ahead and run Internet Explorer. And I'm just getting, I'll scroll to the top here to make sure, but I just have the Bing page as a home screen. Let's go ahead and run this. Silent. Didn't tell me anything. Now, can anybody guess what's going to happen here? I run Internet Explorer and I still just see the Bing page. Any ideas? Actually, I just have to log off. So if I choose that, we'll log off with my Bob accounts, sign out, sign back in. Bounce out to the desktop, and now if I run Internet Explorer, I've got, I actually added, remember? Can anybody, you know why it did this, right? I now have Bing, and MSN because I chose not to replace the existing home screen. So I actually added Bing and MSN to the list of home screens. Now I have 3. Okay. So it works as advertised. Any questions on this before we leave this? Yes? Does changing the search provider work in this version? I have not heard feedback to the contrary. I have not tried it myself. So as far as I know, it works. But again, I've got a stack of business cards. If your experience is different, I definitely want to hear from you. So the way I look at my new marketing role, incidentally, I didn't mention, but I'm responsible for security, performance, and privacy. And I'm also responsible for Internet Explorer's relationship with commercial customers. So the way I look at customer evidence If you come to me and say, wow, this is great, it works as advertised, that's fantastic. I can go to the engineering team and say, great job. If you come to me and say, hey, this doesn't work, I want to know that as well, because I can go to the engineering team and say, hey, you guys need to work on this. So I'm in a good position for both positive and negative feedback, and I like the real-world feedback. Like I said, I'm under no delusions here. We want to make sure that everything works as advertised for your environment. All right, let's keep going. I do have a lot of content to cover. So, as I mentioned, the wizard's available 24 languages, and it's available, it now supports Windows 7 and Windows 8. Now let's talk for a minute about deployment methodologies. As I mentioned when I kicked off the session, the good news here is we're not asking you to do anything special. We're not asking you to install a different management tool. We're not asking you to think about deploying Internet Explorer 10 any differently than you would anything else in your Windows infrastructure. There are two primary scenarios that we run into. One is obviously you have an existing computer running Windows and you want to upgrade that computer. In this case, it might be Windows 7. It could be Windows 8. It's not going to be, for IE 10 at least, we don't support Vista or XP or other operating systems. But specifically for Windows 7 or for Windows 8, updating the settings or changing the configuration of Internet Explorer, you can create packages for that, as I showed you. And the bottom line here is I go through some of these System Center Configuration Manager, System Center Essentials, Windows Server Update Services, Windows Intune. Whatever you happen to use for pushing out updates or pushing out packages, we want to be able to support that. And you can even use a share and push it out through group policy if you're still doing things like that. A little more problematic, I think, than using some of the automated tools. You can also deploy it as part of your Windows deployment. I do talk to customers all the time who say they're taking the big leap. They're going from Windows XP to Windows 7, and they're going from their Windows XP with Internet Explorer 8 up to Windows 7 with Internet Explorer 10 or even Internet Explorer 9, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So there are a lot of customers who take that big leap, and running it as a pilot and testing kicking the tires on IE 10 is absolutely warranted. And then there are a lot of customers who have already deployed Windows 7 maybe with IE 9 or IE 8, and they're looking at updating to IE 10 kind of as a precursor to take some of the pain out of a later update. In other words, if you can upgrade to IE 10 on Windows 7, then that's one checkbox that you don't have to worry about when you consider upgrading your Windows infrastructure later on, whether it's this year, next year, year after, your timetable. In general, the guidance that we give customers is if you're relatively early in your deployment planning and you've been considering Internet Explorer 9 or even IE 8, we strongly encourage you to look at Internet Explorer 10. A lot of the work that you will have already done to remediate IE 9 problems actually carries over to IE 10. In other words, if you've done some work on the back end, your developers have updated the systems to use modern standards and standards compatibility mode, then a lot of that work's already done and everything will work with IE 10. This is one reason why we've been pushing out Internet Explorer 10 through Windows Update to consumers. We know that if they're already running IE 9, that the step to up to IE 10 is going to be relatively painless for most consumer customers. Commercial customers obviously have special needs. You have more web applications that you're trying to support internally. You definitely want to test everything before you deploy, and I understand that completely. So the good news is IE 10 does make for an easier transition if you've been considering IE 9. Now, if you're a little further along, you're already deploying, say, Windows 7 with IE 9, start running a pilot in parallel with IE 10. You might actually be pleasantly surprised to see that IE 10 runs a lot of your same web apps and sites with very little change. Again, we have that natural tension between wanting to take the web forward and wanting to be backward compatible. And of course, the good news on Windows 7 is you just have the legacy desktop browser. You don't have the immersive, touch-friendly experience, so you don't even need to worry about that experience. It's really just the legacy desktop browser. And the improvements, the significant improvements that we have in IE 10 over IE 9 are really in the areas of standard support, performance, because we did improve performance, especially the things like the Chakra JavaScript engine on IE 10. And we also made some security improvements. I'll mention this just briefly, and I do a separate 90-minute session just on security. So I'm happy to talk with you after the session if you have some interest in this area. But we had some things in IE 10 that we actually backported to Windows 7. There's a security feature called Force ASLR. ASLR basically means address space layout randomization. What it says is, if a hacker knows that there's a particular process that's running at a particular place in memory, and they can insert their code into that spot, they can essentially take over your computer. So what we've done is for a couple of versions now, we've had the ability to randomize where in memory that process runs. And IE 10 on Windows 8 improves that significantly by having, in 64-bit, we actually have high entropy address space layout randomization, which basically means there's over a terabyte of addressable space. So we're not saying that this will completely eliminate this kind of heap spraying attack, but we are saying that we're trying to make it as impractical as possible for somebody to hit, a terabyte of addressable memory. Now for Windows 7, and the reason I mention this is, for Windows 7, there's another feature we introduced called Force ASLR that will take a process that wasn't originally written to use address space layout randomization. In other words, the process itself wasn't written to be randomized in terms of memory, and it forces that process to be randomized. We actually backported Force ASLR to Windows 7. I sometimes get the question, why did it take you guys so long to introduce Internet Explorer 10 on Windows 7? And one of the answers that makes sense is we actually had the Windows 7 team, the engineering team, introduce some patches and some features into Windows 7 to support better security for IE 10. So there are some reasons, and as I mentioned, there's basically, it comes down to three. It's better standard support for HTML5, CSS3. It's better performance, but the big one for me is better security. IE 10 on Windows 7 is going to be inherently a little more secure than IE 9. All right, let's talk about browser management for a little bit. As I mentioned before, there's about 1,500 group policies. And it's interesting. I see a lot of reactions here. If I present to military, their eyes get really big and they say, wow, this is fantastic. This is exactly the kind of granularity we need. If I present to a lot of IT pros like I used to be, their eyes get big and they say, wow, I don't want to have to deal with that. That's way too many group policies. How do you manage all these things? And there are some best practices. There are some administrative templates you can use. But there's also a really easy GP search tool that I wanted to introduce you to. If you haven't seen it yet, either as part of this conference or before, I wanted to bring it up and give you a quick demo and show you how easy it is to find and implement a particular group policy. Now, the way I like to think about Internet Explorer, because I realized the other day I've been checking email for 30 years. I used to support Linux, Unix, Macintosh, you name it. I'm kind of an open market guy. I appreciate the competition because I think that makes Internet Explorer and Windows so much better. The way I like to think about customizing Internet Explorer is that it is a highly configurable environment. In other words, I have customers ask me, they say, we don't have access to your source code like we do, say, WebKit or another rendering engine. How can I make changes to the way that Internet Explorer behaves? And the distinction that I like to make is, I don't think of this as customizable. I think of it as highly configurable. These 1,500 group policies mean I can configure the behavior of the browser and fine-tune that and tailor it to my individual needs for my organization. And the great news is, at the end of the day, this is a supported package. The configuration that I'm creating is supported by Microsoft, so it's just part of my Windows support. On some other packages, yes, you can customize it. I don't know if anybody has customized your device drivers in Linux or Unix, but you're kind of going out on a limb there. You make some changes, you recompile it, you run, and you hope your hard drives don't break. That's kind of where I'm coming at here. With 1,500 group policies, it is highly configurable, but I don't really think of it as customizable in terms of being able to change code. The great news is it's still supported at the end of the day, if you configure it. Now, there's one other thing I wanted to mention about this, and that's there are a couple policies that I call out here. Default browser is one. It'll call out whether or not Internet Explorer is the default browser. There are an increasing number of commercial customers who are opening up to new devices or other operating systems, other browsers. And that's fine, but we also want to make sure that we give you the ability to control that. I have had commercial customers say, we don't want to open up our environment, we just want to lock it down for IE. And that's fine. We can give you the ability to notify users, and certainly through other group policies, you can lock out other packages. But we want to be as flexible as possible. If a user is running Chrome and maybe it doesn't have all the ActiveX controls that run with your particular line of business application, we want you to give you the ability to at least alert that user and say, hey, Internet Explorer isn't the default browser. Do you want the opportunity to switch? Again, trying to be as flexible as possible for your environment. The last thing on the screen is Adobe Flash. There's been some confusion about our support for Adobe Flash, so I kind of wanted to clarify that for you guys here today. When we initially announced pre-release version of Windows 8 that included Internet Explorer 10, and we explained that we had two experiences. We had the immersive Windows 8 IE10 experience that's very touch-friendly, and we had the legacy desktop browser. And we explained that it was our vision to have really a plug-in free web that was a little more secure, standards-based. Customers in general said, wow, that's great, but don't break my website. Don't break my Flash content. And in talking with a lot of developers and a lot of you folks, what we found out was, in general, people think that the long-term future is absolutely standards-based, HTML5, CSS3, but we don't want to force you to upgrade on our timetable. You should be able to upgrade on your timetable. So we worked very closely with Adobe to incorporate some elements of Flash into the browser. And let me explain a couple of the criteria that we used. One is, again, Internet Explorer 10 is supported not just on Windows 8, Windows 7, but it's also on Windows RT devices, ARM-based devices that really need to be power efficient. They really need to be, have a long battery life. Now, Flash has evolved over the years to include everything in the kitchen sink. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's Flash capabilities to capture your video. There's Flash capabilities to capture your audio. It makes me a little nervous having a security background, but there's lots and lots and lots of things that Flash can do. But most websites don't use that functionality. So we worked very closely with Adobe to incorporate a subset of Flash that, one, doesn't kill your performance, it won't kill your battery life, and two, maybe take a look at some of the things that might not work well in a touch environment or might run a little bit of a security risk. So at the end of the day, we had a subset of Flash features that work in the immersive, touch-friendly experience. Initially, we had a wait list for the sites that would work there. What we said was, you know what, we're not absolutely sure how many of these sites worldwide work with our instantiation of Flash, these features that we chose to support. And in fact, we found that 90+% of the sites that were submitted worked fine without any problems. So starting in March, starting last month, we flipped the switch and went from a white list of sites that would work, that were approved for the immersive experience. We flipped the switch to a blacklist of sites that were not approved for that immersive experience. And of course, those users in Windows 8 have the out of choosing to go out to the desktop where it'll show any site. What we're really trying to do is optimize for the touch experience and optimize for Windows RT devices. So hopefully that explains the kind of the rationale that we took when we chose to incorporate Flash, and also the switch that we made from having a white list of sites that would work with an immersive to now just having a very short black list. Yes, question?
With Flash being integrated into IE10, how does that affect Flash that is already installed on the computer if you upgrade to IE10?
That's a good question. So the question is, how does it affect computers that already have Flash installed? And I think the real question there is for Windows 7 customers, because Windows 8, you're getting IE10 as built into Windows 8. For Windows 7 customers who have Flash installed, the legacy desktop experience will be using your Flash engine, is my understanding. I've tried it myself, and that seems to be the answer. That seems to be the behavior. Please let me know if you notice something different. Okay, I mentioned a search tool for group policies. How many of you are familiar with this one? I like to gauge. Hopefully more and more people will be familiar. Just a couple hands going up, so it's worth covering in a little bit of detail. gpsearch.azurewebsites.net. It's worth memorizing if you work with group policies, or at least jotting down, because this has filters for various Microsoft products, as well as making it very, very easy for you to search for a particular group policy. Let me show you what I mean. We'll switch over to my demo machine again here. All right, so I'm going to fire up Internet Explorer. And of course, we're going to get all three of our home pages. I think is it .NET? Yeah. All right, so this basically gives me a list of group policies, and I can drill down and kind of browse through the policy tree. What's really easy to do is also simply to filter by product. So I can filter it for an earlier version of Internet Explorer, or for a more recent version. I'm going to choose IE10. And what I'm going to do a search on is disable general. So what I want to be able to do, and it may take a second to find the right policy, what I want it to do is disable the General tab in Internet Options. And let me show you what I mean. We'll go ahead and pull that tab up, and I'm going to go into Internet Options. So you see here there's a General tab, and say I've set the home screen and I've got it set the way I want. I don't want people customizing this for their own home screen. I don't want people changing some of these settings, so I'm actually going to take the whole tab away so customers can't see that. And there's a couple of policies here. There's a computer policy and there's a user policy. And in this case, what I'm going to do is go ahead and run the user policy. So I'm going to run gpedit.msc. Now, this particular machine isn't a member of a domain because I didn't want to have to deal with a domain controller. I just set it up as a standalone, so I can set a local policy and then have that policy take effect pretty quickly. So let's browse down. User configuration, administrative templates, Windows components. Let me slide this over a little bit so you can see where I'm going here. Windows components, Internet Explorer. Internet Control Panel. And then this is where I can see policies like disable the general page, disable the privacy page, disable the programs page, and so on. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull up the disable general page, enable that policy. And now if I scroll off to the right, it should show enabled. Yep. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to quit Internet Explorer. I'm going to run my command prompt just to make sure I'm going to run it elevated. And I'm going to say gp update force. All right, policy update has completed successfully for my local machine. And now, I don't think I have to log off, but we'll try it. Internet options, I no longer have a general tab. So it's that simple. You can create a template that includes the policies that you want to enable, and simply apply that to a particular organizational unit, or and you can apply that obviously at a computer level or at a user level. Most of these settings apply for either, or for both rather. There are two different policies, one for computer, one for users. But this gives you, as I mentioned before, highly configurable Internet Explorer. I've talked to people who have spent a lot of time customizing this for their environments, and I've talked to a lot of people who say, yeah, I don't really need to touch it. It's pretty secure by default. I don't worry about it. It obviously depends on your particular environment. We just want to make sure that you have the tools that you need if you do want to lock it down, if you do want to customize it. Any questions about this? Yes? Are you able to set the site list for security zones without having to edit the registry? I haven't tried that with the new version, but I think you still have to go into the registry. And I'll show you, let me skip back. There's a few other group policies that I wanted to point out to you. Actually, I take that back. I have a list of some group policies in the app compat section. But you can create, for example, a group policy that sets a particular compatibility mode. You do have to enter those into the registry. I don't think there's an easy way to enter that list. Yeah, there was a question or comment? Yes?
I think you can do that through the site to zone.
Site to zone manager. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, question? I believe it's still over. So the question is, does the GPO override, or is it additive to what's already set within the browser? I believe the GPOs still overwrite what the browser uses. But again, that's an experimental question. I haven't run into that particular problem myself, so we can try it and see what the behavior is. Actually, tell you what, grab my business card. I'll try it tonight and see what the behavior looks like. Yes? I'm sorry? Group policy preferences. Nothing, no news there, as far as I know. All right, this is the app compat section, or as I like to call it, app compat for IT pros. I mentioned just briefly a flag or a switch that developers can use. But really, most of what I'm talking about here are things you can do without cracking the website, without actually going in and changing code. There's a variety of reasons for that. I think a couple that are best known are the developer may have left. You may be supporting, and I've been there, done that. You may be stuck supporting a web application that's 5 years, 6 years, 7 years old, and you have no idea who originally developed it. So if it's not broken, don't fix it. You might not want to go in and make changes to that site. Ultimately, of course, on your roadmap, you should be looking at updating those sites for modern standards. I think the biggest reason there is performance more than anything. I talk to a lot of customers who say, yeah, I'm pulling open a website in Internet Explorer in our internal web app, and I'm looking at it within another browser, Firefox or Chrome, and it's really, really slow in Internet Explorer. So I say, okay, let's figure out what document mode you're actually using. Oh, you're running in compatibility mode for IE7 or IE8, which means you're running an older JavaScript engine. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can just switch it to standards mode and everything will work. And of course, at that point, it's just as fast as any other browser. But sometimes you have to do a little bit of remediation work to get that to work properly with modern standards. And we'll talk through what steps and tools you have available without having to crack open that website. One of the easiest things is compatibility view. And there's a little bit of confusion about this. I know it's not the easiest icon in the world to even understand, but the broken page icon on the address toolbar, if you click that as a consumer or as a user, will add that website to compatibility view. The icon itself turns blue, and it'll actually render that website in IE7 mode. Now you notice here, I have at the bottom here, this is the compatibility view settings, and I'll show you that in a second. Compatibility view settings by default today displays intranet sites in compatibility view mode, which means intranet sites are going to be running in IE7 mode by default. I don't think we're quite ready to flip that switch. Based on conversations with commercial customers, we're not quite ready to have the default be standards mode, because I think that's going to break more things today than it would fix. At some point, after folks have remediated their site, gotten them up to modern standards, at some point, certainly we would think about changing the default behavior of that switch, but that is a group policy. So you do have control over this. You can control it either through the distribution package, the IEAK, or you can have a group policy in place that enforces that. The other thing is compatibility view list, or CVL. Now, it's worth going into a little bit of detail here because I think the CVL is sometimes misunderstood. The CVL is an XML file hosted by Microsoft that has details about what rendering mode, what document mode to use when interpreting a particular website. This is also, incidentally, what we used for what used to be the whitelist and is now the blacklist for Flash sites. So this compatibility view list has a little bit more flexibility than either compatibility view or group policies, and I'll explain that. Compatibility view, if you click that button, it will render a site in IE7 mode. The CVL actually has the ability to explicitly tell you to run a particular site in IE10, IE9, IE8, IE7, Quirks mode. Lots of flexibility on how it tells you to render that site. Now, by default, the checkbox is checked at the bottom, download updated compatibility list for Microsoft. There's actually two different lists. There's one for IE9 and one for IE10. So if you're having problems or experiencing problems, it's worth checking kind of into both lists. But this is where we use a little bit of crowdsourcing, but it's more working one-on-one with site developers. We'll get requests all the time from a site developer who says, you guys are coming out with IE10, that's great. We're not quite ready to update our site. We still need to run in IE7 mode. Rather than go through all our code and add an extra meta tag that tells it to run in IE7 mode, we'd rather have you guys just add it to your compatibility view list. And so we do that. Yes? The question is, do we have any flexibility on compatibility view for you to be able to say, for my environment, compatibility view means IE9 or IE8 instead of IE7 by default? The answer is today there is not. We don't have that flexibility. Today, if you use compatibility view, it's going to be in IE7 mode, but there are some other ways you can remediate how the site is rendered, and I'll explain that in a second. So the CVL is an easy way for Microsoft to host this. Now, how would this come up in your environment? Let's say you're running with an extranet partner or an extranet site or some kind of, you have a partner who has a tool that you use on the internet, and that partner has a tool that needs to run in IE8 mode or IE7 mode or a particular document mode. You can ask them, or suggest to us to go ask them on your behalf, to run that, to add their site to this CVL so that it will run by default in a particular mode. This came up recently with education. There's a particular education software package that students all over the US use when they're checking their grades or checking their homework. And we had to work with that developer to say, okay, you have a long-term roadmap to update your site, and that's great. Temporarily, let's get you in the CVL to make sure that it doesn't break for all those customers out there who are using your site today. And there's F12 developer tools. This is a little bit of a misnomer because I'm not a developer. I use these all the time. There is a way that you can do kind of a network trace. It has some functionality. I actually like using Fiddler a little more. Fiddler 2 by Eric Lawrence is a great tool for capturing network traces. But this has some of that functionality built in. What we're talking about in this session, you can pretty much ignore everything else on the screen except for the browser mode and document mode. The browser mode is what the browser tells the website that it is. So it tells the website by default that it's Internet Explorer 10. Now, in some cases, developers years ago used to write, sometimes they would write markup for a particular browser. So if you were running IE7, it would actually send you different markup than if you were running, say, another browser, IE6, IE8, or something else. Not a best practice. Of course, all developers today know that they should be writing for modern standards. They shouldn't be writing for a particular browser. But there are still legacy websites out there that will actually send different markup depending on what browser it thinks is talking to it. So it's worth having this in your bag of tricks for testing emulator modes if all else fails. But the first thing you should try if you go into this is actually try different document modes. And incidentally, this does work on Windows RT devices. It works great on Windows RT. I use this all the time for troubleshooting on my Microsoft Surface, on my tablet. Document mode is how the browser itself is going to change how it renders a particular page. And of course, we have the standards mode, IE10. We have 9 standards, 8 standards, 7, and then what we call quirks mode. So lots of different ways of interpreting what that website actually is going to render up. Let's do a quick demo there. All right, I'm going to close out Internet Explorer and start it fresh. Let's just get, I'll pull up Bing. If I hit F12 now, it's going to bring up the F12 developer tools, and you'll see that I have these drop-down options. Standards, quirks, IE9, 8, 7, and then IE5 quirks. IE10 actually has 2 different quirks modes. Incidentally, I mentioned a couple of group policies briefly. I'll just go ahead and talk about those. I think those are on my next slide. But we do have 2 group policies that you can use to explicitly set a particular mode for a website. Today, we only have 2 group policies. We have an IE7 group policy, so you can tell it to run that website in in IE7 mode. We also have a quirks mode group policy, and it's the second quirks mode. It's the IE5 quirks mode. It's not the IE10 quirks mode. And I mention that specifically because there are a lot of older legacy sites that require this older quirks mode. Say, ones that were written originally for IE5 or IE6 might tend to run a little better than that. And that was what I was mentioning when I answered this gentleman's question about how can we explicitly set a particular site. That's the functionality that we have today, is through group policy, you do have the ability to set it in one of those two modes. The feedback that I have already given engineering is it would be great to have explicit group policies for each of these document modes. So we've already given that feedback to engineering, and I don't know what the future holds, but I think if there's enough interest in these kind of features, then obviously we may prioritize those features in some future version. Yes? These settings, unfortunately, aren't stored in the registry. These are actually just, I'm recommending this as a troubleshooting tool for you to figure out what mode actually works with a particular site. Once you know what mode works with a site, then you have kind of a decision tree to go through on, well, if it runs fine in quirks mode, I have a couple things at my disposal. I can run it using a group policy. I can add that to a group policy. Or I can work with the site developer to get it added to the CVL. Or I could work with the developer to get them to add a meta tag into their site itself that tells it what explicit mode to use. So there are a few different tools at your disposal. I'm just recommending this as a quick and dirty tool for IT pros to be able to troubleshoot a site. I get calls all the time or emails from all the time from folks who say, my site doesn't work. And 5 minutes with this tool, I can come back to them and say, here's why your site doesn't work. Here's a temporary workaround, and here are some options for you. Let's go ahead and pull up a site that is broken. And I'm not picking on anybody. I just did a quick search 20 minutes ago because, ironically enough, the demo site that I typically use, they upgraded recently to modern standards. So that's great. I don't know if somebody in one of my audiences reached out to them and said, hey, it would be great if you updated your site, but I no longer have access to that particular movie theater chain, which required IE7 compatibility mode. Now it works great in standards. And I think that's what we want to see from all developers. But in the meantime, I do have, and I've reached out to BaileyCustomHomes.com. I'm not picking on anybody. It looks like they're great home builders, but maybe less so at building websites. So if I pull this up, it's right now set in Quirks mode, but it's running in IE10 Quirks mode. And in fact, if I scroll down a little bit, I'm trying to find some content. Not really seeing a whole lot of content here. Actually, there's my scroll bar. Okay, we have a little bit. It was updated in 2011, but and it says this website best viewed in Internet Explorer 7 or earlier. So with just a couple steps, they could actually remediate this so it would work fine in any version of Internet Explorer. And what I wanted to show here was if I go ahead and try to switch document mode, standards mode, same behavior, IE9, a little better, IE8, same thing, IE7, aha, pictures, text. Well, there was a picture. There we go. So this is obviously the mode that, and now we have some buttons available. So just quick and dirty troubleshooting to say that, this site was originally designed for IE7. Maybe they don't want to go hire another developer. That's fine. They have some tools at their disposal to help, render the site properly for anybody looking at the site using IE9, using IE8, using IE10. And what they could do is they could add a meta tag, and I'll talk about that more in a second, that actually tells explicitly the document mode. If they don't want to crack the site open, they can simply send an email to iepo@microsoft.com that says, please render my site in IE7 mode, and we'll add them to the compatibility view list. In fact, after this session, I'll reach out to them and ask them if they want me to do that for them. Another site will be gone from my demo, but that's okay. All right, there's another thing I wanted to show here, and that's actually, let me just bring up a user agent string site. This tells me what user agent string this browser is telling the website. And I just wanted to prove to you that, if we change the browser mode here from IE10 to IE9, it's going to tell it that it's IE9. If I change it down to IE8, it's going to tell it it's IE8, and so on. Again, I would try the document mode for troubleshooting first, but for some older legacy websites, they could have markup. It may be sending different markup depending on what browser it thinks you're running. All right, the last thing I wanted to show here was, it's a little bit of a trick, but if I hit F10 and use the Tools drop-down menu, this is how I get to compatibility view settings. It's a little bit hidden. It's hard to find, but this is the easiest way I know, so I wanted to mention it to you. And if I look here, compatibility view settings, I can add a particular site, and I can, for example, the home builder site, if that's a site that I go to often, I can add it for myself to my compatibility view, and it'll be, it'll always be rendered in IE7 mode. It'll always work fine. All right, any questions on this? All right. Let's switch back. I mentioned some of the group policies. Here's a list of a few. Of course, the presentation's available for download, so you don't need to write all these down. But there's just a couple I wanted to bring to your attention. One of them is the policies for Internet Explorer 7 sites and the policy list for Quirks mode sites. Again, that's IE5 Quirks. It's the original Quirks mode, so that's for really, really old sites that are going to work fine for that particular mode. You can also turn off or on standards mode for local intranet sites. Maybe for your sites that are a little more updated, you may have IE8 sites, IE9 sites. You may want to turn off the running in compatibility view by default for your intranet. And then you have some flexibility on obviously how you control compatibility view. Question, comment? How did I happen to find what? I'm sorry? How did I find the last website? I do searches periodically on does not work with IE9 or best with IE7 or before. Now, we do have a team of developers at Microsoft. Actually, it's kind of a cross-developer marketing function that check the top 10,000 websites according to Alexa. And we reach out proactively to those website developers and tell them, hey, we notice your website's broken for IE8 customers. Do you mind if we do this switch? Or do you mind if we add this tweak? But there's a long tail. There's a long tail of websites below the top 10,000 or so websites of folks like that who still, small business owners, still want to be able to reach their customers, but may not have some of that technical expertise. So we absolutely want to help those folks as well. I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just saying, been there, done that. I first developed the first websites in Vi or Notepad that I did. So I'm not a website developer. Probably all the websites that I ever developed have been, obsoleted by now and replaced with better stuff. So summary of app compat steps here. Really, I think it comes down to troubleshooting what application or what document mode works best for that particular application. And then once you know what document mode works best, you have a few different tools at your disposal. One is compatibility view. For intranet sites, just simply turning that on by default or even enforcing it through group policy is one option. Using group policies, if it's an IE7 or Quirks mode, for either of those modes. And again, we've given the feedback to engineering that it would be great to have additional modes. The one developer tool that I'll mention is the XUA compatible meta tag. And this is where I might suggest to a developer, if you just add that meta tag to the header with whatever document mode you want your site to be rendered in, that's a quick and easy fix. And there are lots of folks who do this. But again, all of these should be viewed as temporary fixes. Because I have run into occasionally the problem of somebody who added the XUA compatible tag, and then somebody updated the site to run fine in standards mode. It's still running in IE7 compatibility mode, which means it's running relatively slow. And now we need to get to the developer to go in the site and remove that compatibility tag. Yes? That's a great best practice. He said for legacy stuff, they use the older compatibility mode. But for new sites that they're updating, they've instructed their developers to add that XUA compatible tag specifically for IE10 mode. And I think that'll actually work well in the future with future versions of Internet Explorer because it'll know what compatibility mode to use. So that's a great best practice. Thank you. Now that I don't actually do consulting in the field, I rely on your expertise to help me with some of these specific examples. So thank you. All right, and the last thing is obviously the compatibility view list. There's a lot of flexibility with the compatibility view list, but again, it's only for external sites. Now, there's one other tool that I'll mention, and I have this during my final tool, but it's modern.ie. Modern.ie is a website that we launched just recently, and it will actually scan a website for basically three buckets, three categories. One, it will check compatibility with other versions of Internet Explorer. We realize not all developers use every version of Internet Explorer, so it will check compatibility with IE10, IE9, IE8, IE7. It checks to make sure that the markup is compatible with those versions. The second thing, it checks against modern standards. So it checks to make sure that it'll actually work across devices, across other browsers. We realize that Internet Explorer isn't the only browser. We realize Windows isn't the only operating system. So the second thing modern.ie checks is modern standards. Is it going to work okay on your other tablets, on your other devices? And the third thing that modern.ie checks is there's some easy things you can do, add to a website that allow you to pin it in Windows 8 with your logo. So it gives some instructional guidance there on, if you add this code, someone can pin your site, and instead of having a generic logo in Windows 8, it'll actually have your branded logo for their website. Again, we're blurring the lines a little bit between an application and a web application. All right. Some additional resources. I want to be respectful of your time. We only have a few minutes left, but I did want to cover these resources briefly. And then when you download the deck, you can avail yourself of them. There's obviously TechNet Springboard site for IT pros, MSDN for developers. Test Drive is a good one. There are a few test drive experiences that really highlight touch or highlight some other standards compatibility, for example. And if you scroll all the way to the right and click on Site Map, you'll see a whole host of demos that you can kind of interact with and look at. IE Gallery is where you can learn more about things like tracking protection lists. Modern.ie is the site I just mentioned that can help you remediate websites. Before you ask, the first question I asked when I saw this tool was, that sounds great. How can I run it on a corporate intranet? And they tell me that they've got a version now that will run on your local intranet so you can check your local web apps. I have not tested this myself. Not to be too critical, but I really want to test this myself, make sure it works before I recommend it to you. But please go check it out. Test it for yourself. Let me know if it works. And I'll be doing the same. The IE Testing Center, I'll mention just briefly, the approach that Internet Explorer has taken to modern standards like HTML5, CSS3, SVG, is to make sure that we're implementing that standard in the right way. And the way we do that is we write a test case against the standard. We'll write a markup, we'll actually code against the standard, and then we submit that test case through to the W3C or ECMA International in the case of JavaScript to make sure that we've implemented the standard in the correct way. I think there are a lot of sites out there that will show you Internet Explorer standards versus other browsers, but it doesn't really speak to the quality of implementation. And we want to make sure that in the testing center, we've actually submitted more than, I think it's 5,700 test cases. And these are all publicly available. If you're a developer, you can go to the site and actually use this code in your own site to make sure that you're writing to modern standards that'll work on, ideally, any browser. Internet Explorer Beauty of the Web is where I send my mom if she asks, what do you do for a living? This is a great site that shows how Internet Explorer 10 shines for consumers. So it kind of talks about performance, security, privacy in consumer language. There's an IE engineering blog and an IE marketing blog, and I think both of them are worth checking occasionally because we do have good information coming out from both teams. The GP search tool I showed you in a demo. And that's it for today's session. Are there any additional questions? Yes?
If you install IE10 and you have some problems that you can't get around, can you go back to IE9 on the workstation?
The question was, if I install IE10 on Windows 7 and I want to go back to IE9, can I uninstall it? And the answer is yes, and that I have tested, just to make sure it would work. So the answer is yes. I want to be respectful of your time. I always finish on time. We're within 45 seconds of the end. So thank you very much for your time. Hopefully you found this a productive session. Thank you.